On a Thursday morning in November of 2019, Derek Callahan stood at the edge of a logging road carved into the side of Saddle Mountain in Clatsop County, Oregon, and watched $640,000 worth of machinery disappear into a ravine. His TigerCat 1085 harvester, the most advanced piece of equipment his company owned, delivered to the job site just 14 months earlier, had broken through a section of road that the county survey said would hold, slid sideways off the berm, and come to rest 22 feet below the road's edge in a tangle of second-growth fir. The machine sat at a 40-degree angle, its cab buried to the roofline in soft volcanic soil, its boom arms snapped against the hillside. Every cable they had tried had gone slack. Every anchor they had sunk had pulled free. The machine wasn't just stuck. It was vanishing. Let me tell you what Derek Callahan tried in the 3 days before Walter Harmon arrived, because you need to understand how desperate the situation had become before you can understand what happened next out on the first day. Derek brought in 2D8 bulldozers from a rental yard in Astoria. Combined, they represented 420 horsepower and enough drawbar pulled to move a building. His crew rigged a double-block system, a logging technique that doubles mechanical advantage, and set anchors in the solid timber above the road. The dozers pulled until the anchors groaned and then pulled harder. The chain held. The anchors held. The TigerCat did not move a single inch. It had settled into a pocket of clay and glacial silt left over from the last ice age. And the more force they applied from above, the deeper the suction pulled it down. They disassembled the rig at dusk. First day gone, and the machine had sunk another 3 inches. On the second day, Derek called a heavy equipment recovery company out of Portland. They arrived with a Liebherr LTM mobile crane, 100 tons of lifting capacity mounted on 8 axles. The crane operator said he had recovered machines from worse situations. He set outriggers, rigged his main hook to the harvester's front frame, and applied 112,000 pounds of upward lift. The front of the machine rose 4 inches. Then the rear axle, freed from the suction on one side, pivoted in the clay, and the harvester slid another 3 feet sideways and 6 inches deeper. The crane operator shook his head and began packing up his outriggers. He charged Derek $19,000 for the day. The TigerCat was now at a 47-degree angle. On the third morning, Derek called every recovery contractor within 200 miles. One of them, a man who had spent 30 years pulling logging equipment out of the Coast Range. Listen to the description of the site, the soil type, the angle, the previous failed attempts. Then he said something Derek did not expect to hear. He said, "I know a man who might be able to help you, but you're not going to like the answer." Derek said he would take any answer at this point. The contractor gave him a phone number. The number belonged to Walter Harmon. Walter's truck appeared at the top of the Saddle Mountain Road at 7:15 on a Thursday morning. Let me tell you what that truck looked like because it matters to the story. It was a 1961 Ford F600 painted the color of old barnboard. The bed was empty except for a coil of logging chain and a wooden toolbox that had been on that truck since before Walter had been alive. Walter drove it at the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. He parked at the edge of the road, got out, and walked to the berm where Derek Callahan and his crew were standing. He looked down at the TigerCat for a long time without speaking. He studied the angle of the machine, the slope of the hill, the consistency of the soil on the road shoulder, the direction of the second-growth timber above the site. Derek's crew watched the old man in silence. Walter was 78 years old, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent his entire life in terrain that punished carelessness. After 4 full minutes of silence, he turned to Derek. "I can get her out," he said. Let me tell you about Derek Callahan, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the way he responded. Derek was 44 years old and had built Callahan timber from a single-use skidder he bought at auction in 2001 for $32,000. He had worked 18-hour days for the first 5 years, taken no salary, lived on the job sites in a camper trailer, and built his company contract by contract until it was the largest independent logging operation in Clatsop County. By 2019, he had 23 employees, a fleet of modern equipment worth more than $4 million, and a reputation for getting difficult timber off difficult terrain. Derek was a man who had built everything he had by trusting technology and refusing to accept that a problem was unsolvable. That belief had never failed him, until now. When he looked at Walter Harmon, at the worn denim jacket, the rubber logging boots that were at least 20 years old, the hands that had the texture of weathered bark, he didn't see help. He saw a courtesy call to an old man who someone had mistakenly thought might have an answer.
All right, this is the spot. Yeah, looks like a tough haul.
What are you going to get her out with? Derek asked. My steam donkey, Walter said. Derek looked at him. Your steam donkey. 1929 Lima Yarder. She's back at my property, about 11 miles from here. One of Derek's crew members laughed. Then another. Derek didn't laugh. He looked at Walter carefully. Walter, I have had a 100-ton crane on that machine. I've had 2D8 dozers running a double block system. Nothing has moved it. What in the world makes you think a steam donkey from 1929 is going to do what none of that could? Let me tell you about the way Walter answered, because the answer is the reason this story is still being told in Clatsop County. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He looked at Derek the way a man looks at a student who has asked a question he's been waiting for. Your dozers make horsepower, he said, and your crane makes lift. But what that machine down there needs isn't horsepower and it isn't lift. What it needs is torque, sustained mechanical torque, applied at the right angle with a main line long enough to reach that anchor timber. He pointed to a stand of old-growth Douglas fir on the ridge above the road. My Lima can put 40,000 pounds of pull on a mainline cable for as long as it takes. It doesn't have pressure relief valves. It doesn't have a computer deciding how hard it can work. It just pulls, and it will keep pulling until that machine comes out or the cable breaks. Derek studied the old man. How much will this cost me? Donation to the Clatsop County Historical Society, Walter said. You decide how much. Let me tell you about Walter's Lima steam donkey, because it is the real reason this story exists. The Lima Locomotive Works built the machine in 1929 at their plant in Lima, Ohio. The same year the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began, the year that would eventually bankrupt half the timber companies in the Pacific Northwest. It was a yarder model designed specifically for old-growth logging in the Coast Range. Its specifications read like an artifact from another age. A firebox boiler capable of producing 250 pounds per square inch of steam pressure. A single-cylinder steam engine rated at 120 horsepower, but capable of producing sustained torque that no horsepower rating could fully describe. 2 drums. A main drum carrying 1,800 feet of 1 1/4 inch mainline cable, and a smaller haul-back drum for returning the rigging. The whole machine weighed 22 tons and rode on a heavy oak sled that allowed it to be moved through timber by its own cable. Walter's grandfather, August Harmon, had bought it new in 1929 for $3,800, more money than the family farm had earned in the previous 3 years. August had mortgaged 40 acres to pay for it, convinced the machine would return its cost in the first logging season. He was right. The Lima yard more timber in its first year than 2 competing crews could move by hand in 3. August used it from 1929 through 1951, the year a stroke took the use of his right hand and ended his logging career. August's son Raymond, Walter's father, kept the Lima running until 1963, when a new generation of gas-powered yarders made steam obsolete and the Lima became more expensive to operate than it was worth. Raymond parked it in the equipment shed, tarped it, and told the family it was staying. Not because it was useful, because it was August's machine. Walter had found it in 2007, the year Raymond died. He spent the next 8 years restoring it. New firebrick in the firebox, new packing in the steam cylinders, new cable on both drums. He had the boiler certified by the Oregon Boiler Section. In 2015, Walter fired the Lima for the first time in 52 years, in the same clearing where August had first demonstrated it to the family in 1929. His wife and his son and his daughter-in-law stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the machine come to life with a sound like something very old waking up. Walter didn't say a word. He just stood at the throttle with his hand on the lever and watched the pressure gauge climb. But he had used the Lima 6 times between its restoration and the November morning he stood on the Saddle Mountain Road. Each time, it had recovered equipment that nothing else could move. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever understood something so completely, so deeply, that no amount of skepticism from anyone around you could shake your certainty about it? Have you ever walked into a situation where everyone else had already decided what was possible and what wasn't, and felt, without any doubt, that they were wrong? That is what Walter Harmon carried with him as he drove his 1961 Ford back down the Saddle Mountain Road and pointed it toward home. Not arrogance, not stubbornness, just the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who understood exactly what his machine could do and why. Let me tell you about what it took to get the Lima to the Saddle Mountain site, because that part of the story is not simple. Starting a steam donkey was not like starting a diesel engine. You couldn't turn a key. You had to build a fire in the firebox. Walter used dry fir and alder rounds he split himself and wait for the boiler to make steam. A cold Lima took 4 hours to reach working pressure from cold start. Walter had started the fire at 5 in the morning before he drove up to look at the site. By the time he returned home and hitched the Lima's sled to his old log truck, the pressure gauge read 190 pounds per square inch and climbing. Moving the Lima was its own operation. The machine traveled on its oak sled at a top speed of 8 miles an hour on a good road, 11 miles of coast range road, including 2 miles of unimproved logging road on the backside of Saddle Mountain. Took the better part of 3 hours. Walter arrived at the site at 2:15 in the afternoon. Let me tell you about the moment that machine crested the rise in the Saddle Mountain Road, because Derek Callahan's crew had spent 3 days failing and had started to believe that nothing was going to work. They heard the Lima before they saw it. First Walter's truck engine. Then underneath, it's something else. A rhythmic exhaust beat, a sound none of them under the age of 60 had ever heard coming from a working piece of machinery. Then the truck came over the rise, and behind it came the Lima, trailing steam from its exhaust stack. Its boiler warm with a fire that had been burning for 9 hours. Derek Callahan's crew went completely silent. Walter unhitched the Lima at the edge of the road and positioned it facing uphill toward the old-growth anchor timber on the ridge. He moved with the economy of a man who had done this many times. He didn't rush. He didn't explain himself. He just worked. Let me tell you about the next 22 minutes, because they're the reason this story is still being told in Clatsop County. Walter ran his main line down the slope to the buried Tiger Cat, rigged his choker around the machine's rear axle housing, and ran the cable back up through a snatch block anchored to the largest old-growth fir on the ridge, a tree 6 feet in diameter that had been standing since before the Civil War. The block changed the angle of pull so that the Lima was pulling the Tiger Cat not just up the slope, but slightly sideways, rotating it out of the clay pocket it had settled into over 3 days. It was the same technique his grandfather had taught him. The machine's natural tendency, when stuck, is to settle further in the direction it's already going. The recovery force must work against that tendency at an angle, not directly against it. Walter walked back to the Lima, checked his pressure gauge, 230 pounds per square inch, and looked at Derek. "You want to make sure your crew is clear of the main line," he said. Derek moved his crew back. Walter opened the throttle. The Lima's engine exhaled a deep, measured pulse of steam. The main drum began to turn. The cable lifted off the ground, shedding loose soil as it came taut. The sound changed as the cable took the load, a low, metallic tone that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. Derek's crew took another step back. Then the Tiger Cat moved. Not far. Not dramatically. The rear end rotated 6 inches in the clay. But it moved. A single shout came from somewhere in Derek's crew and was quickly silenced. Walter held the throttle steady. The Lima kept pulling. A foot, then 2. The angle of the machine, which had been tilting towards certain total loss, slowly, visibly changed. The boom arm, wedged against the hillside for 3 days, came free with a sound like a shot. 6 minutes after the cable came taut, the rear end of the Tiger Cat reached the base of the slope. 8 minutes after that, the machine was upright. 18 minutes after Walter opened the throttle, all 4 of the Harvester's tires were on level ground. Walter closed the throttle. The Lima exhaled a long breath of steam. The drum stopped. There was a moment of complete silence on the Saddle Mountain Road. Then Derek Callahan's crew started cheering. Walter didn't celebrate. He walked to the snatch block anchored to the old-growth fir, freed the cable, and began coiling the main line back onto the drum with the same deliberate economy he brought to every task. He didn't look at the Tiger Cat. He didn't look at Derek or his crew. He just worked. Derek walked to the edge of the road and stood looking at his harvester, sitting on solid ground for the first time in 4 days, tilted slightly but intact, its boom arm dented but unbroken. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned and looked at Walter, who was still coiling cable without looking up. Derek had built his company on the belief that technology and resources could solve any problem. He had spent 3 days and tens of thousands of dollars proving that belief wrong. He had watched an old man arrive with a machine from 1929 and do in 22 minutes what nothing else could do in 72 hours. He didn't say anything. He couldn't find the words, so he just stood there and watched Walter work.
The pasture's looking ready for spring already. Yeah, the rain we got did wonders for it. And the new shed's holding up well, too.
Derek Callahan drove to Walter Harmon's property the next morning. Let me tell you about that conversation, because it is the part of the story that matters most. Walter was splitting wood at the edge of his yard when Derek's truck pulled in. He set them all down and waited. "I came to apologize," Derek said. "Nothing to apologize for. My crew laughed at you. In front of everyone. They didn't know," Walter said. "Neither did you. I should have asked more questions before I decided what was possible." Derek looked toward the equipment shed, where the Lima sat cooling in the November air. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. How did you know it would work? Before you even drove up there? Before you saw the machine? How did you know?" Walter picked up 2 rounds of alder and set them on the splitting block. "My grandfather bought that Lima the year everything fell apart," he said. 1929. Most of his neighbors thought he was foolish, spending that kind of money in that kind of year. But August understood something about that machine that the people laughing at him didn't understand. He paused. He used to say it this way: "Modern machinery is built to protect itself. Governors, pressure relief valves. Your machines have computers now that decide how hard they're allowed to work. Those things keep the machine from destroying itself. But they also keep it from doing the hardest work. When the load exceeds what the safety systems will allow, those systems give up. The machine stops before the job is done." Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end on the Saddle Mountain Road. Word of what Walter Harmon had done spread through Clatsop County the way news still travels in rural Oregon. By word of mouth, at the feed store, at the mill, at the counter of the diner in Jewel, where the logging crews ate breakfast before first light. Within 3 weeks, a reporter from the Daily Astorian drove out to Walter's property and asked if she could see the machine. Walter showed her the Lima the way he showed everyone who asked, walking her through the boiler, the drums, the steam cylinders, explaining each component in the careful language of a man who had spent years learning it. The story ran the following Sunday. It was picked up by 2 Portland television stations and eventually by a national agricultural publication that ran a photograph of Walter standing at the Lima's throttle on the front page of its January issue. Over the next 4 years, Walter and the Lima recovered 11 pieces of modern equipment from terrain no other machine could reach. A Caterpillar 336 excavator that had rolled off a river crossing in Tillamook County. a self-loading log truck that had sunk to its frame in soft ground at a timber sale in Columbia County, a John Deere skidder that had slid into a creek in the Coast Range during a winter storm. Walter never charged for the work. Every recovery ended the same way: a conversation about the Historical Society and a handshake to be why 2022, the Clatsop County Historical Society had received enough in donations from Walter's recoveries to complete the restoration of the 1913 courthouse, a project that had sat unfunded for 11 years. Walter died in February of 2024 at the age of 82, in a farmhouse where his grandfather August had raised his family. His son, Raymond, named for Walter's father, took over the property and the Lima both. Raymond had grown up watching his father restore the machine and had spent in the spring of 2026, 7 years after Derek Callahan stood on the Saddle Mountain Road, Derek's son Marcus drove out to Raymond Harmon's property. Marcus was 23 and had been managing a section of his father's timber operation for the past year. He had a Tiger Cat forwarder stuck in a pocket of glacial clay on the north face of a ridge in the Nehalem drainage. 2 recovery contractors had already tried. Raymond listened to the description of the site. He asked about the soil type, the angle of the machine, and the nearest anchor timber. Then he said, "My father recovered your father's machine from a situation very much like that one." Marcus looked at the Lima in the shed. "Is that the same machine?" "Same machine," Raymond said. "Built in 1929. Still works exactly the same way." He walked to the firebox and checked the wood supply. "Give me 4 hours for the boiler," he said, "and call the Historical Society. They'll need a donation." The modern contractors had better equipment, better technology, and better training than anything that existed in 1929. They also had governors and pressure relief valves and computers that decided how hard they were allowed to work. The Lima didn't know how to stop until the job was done. That's what happens when you keep something that was built to last.